An aged hand clutches an amber glass bottle. The fingers, calloused by 30 years of labor, tremble slightly. Inside the pocket of the white uniform, worn at the seams, yet impeccably clean, rests that small treasure that cost Mary almost everything she had. She is leaning against the solid mahogany door of Edward's home office. Her breathing is light, controlled. Behind that door, his voice continues cold as glass. No longer fits the household profile. The severance will be direct deposited. The words come out like sentencing verdicts. Mary closes her eyes for a second. Her back touches the luxurious door. She wears an immaculate uniform, but anyone observing her in that moment would see only a woman suspended between two deaths. The death of a livelihood and the death of a connection to a child who would never see her again. Her eyes open and move to the hallway stretching to the right. There, in the second-floor bedrooms, is Leo. 8 years old, deaf since birth, and the only thing in the entire world he understands when no one else understands him is Mary's hand drawing shapes in the air. She places her hand over the worn notebook tucked into her apron. The paper is yellowed, the pages filled with simple drawings, gestures, expressions, stories told with fingers. It represents 30 years of silent communication with that boy. It represents 30 years of patience that no money in the world could buy. Suddenly, the door behind her moves. Edward's shadow falls over Mary's uniform like a death sentence. She feels the heat of his body approaching. Her breathing becomes even lighter, almost invisible. "You're still here?" His voice isn't aggressive. It's worse, it's indifferent. "Yes, sir, Mary turns slowly. Edward is standing there, his navy blue blazer perfectly tailored, the gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist. His eyes don't see her. They never have. "Gather your things by tomorrow. The new team arrives Monday. But sir, I need to speak about Leo." "Leo will have specialized professionals, bilingual, people suited to deal with his situation. You understand, don't you?" Mary feels the word situation like a blow, as if Leo were a plumbing problem to be solved by a technician. The camera pulls back. We are now in the kitchen 3 hours before that conversation. The mansion is colossal. 20-foot ceilings, windows overlooking a garden that costs more than the house where Mary was born. But that kitchen, despite all the modern technology, feels empty, cold. The stainless steel pans shine without life. Mary is there, as she has been since 5 in the morning. She prepares Edward's coffee while the man leafs through the Wall Street Journal at the 20-foot-long dining table, sitting in one of the 12 chairs. He doesn't eat with the family. The family doesn't exist in that mansion. There is only an overlapping of people living under the same roof. Edward's wife, Marianne, appears briefly. A woman who was a model at 25 and now, at 42, still tries to maintain that illusion. She wears a white silk robe, and her face holds that expression of someone who woke up tired from a party that never ends. She touches Edward's hand quickly as she passes. "Will you be early for the gala?" she asks, taking a cup of coffee Mary offers with a silent gesture. "Of course, need to be there by 8. He doesn't ask how her day was. She doesn't offer the information. Leo comes down the stairs. That boy with brown hair, big attentive eyes that observe everything but hear nothing. He doesn't run. He walks slowly, gripping the wood of the banister as if he needed to anchor himself to something real. When he sees Mary in the kitchen, his face changes. It isn't a smile. It's something deeper. It's recognition. Mary turns to him and her hands begin to move, a series of rapid, fluid gestures that look like a dance. Leo responds with his own gestures, movements even his father couldn't interpret. Their hands converse while Edward turns the page of the newspaper, completely oblivious. It is in that moment that Edward looks up and sees the scene. He sees Mary and Leo communicating in a tongue he never learned, in a language of silence that is more eloquent than any word he could say. Something passes over Edward's face, a quick annoyance, an irritation he buries immediately. He looks at his watch. "Leo, you have the therapy session at 10 with Dr. Sterling, the same one that isn't working." He says this while standing up, as if talking about the weather. Leo doesn't hear. But Mary sees his eyes darken. She knows the boy felt something. Perhaps the shift in the vibration of his father's voice. Perhaps the energy emanating from his frustration. Edward walks past them and places a hand on Leo's shoulder. A gesture that should be affectionate, but feels more like a property inspection. We'll get a better implant soon. They're very expensive, but you deserve the best, son. He says this like someone promising a new car, as if deafness were a malfunction to be fixed with enough money. Later, while Mary tidies Leo's room, she opens her worn notebook. The pages reveal the work of decades, simple but precise drawings of gestures meaning, "Good morning, you are smart, I am here." There are entire scenes drawn out, stories she tells with her hands about life, about the stars, about animals and colors. Leo enters the room. He doesn't knock. He just feels her presence and enters. Mary shows the notebook and points to a new drawing she made yesterday. A gesture that means, "You are special." Leo observes with the attention of someone studying a treasure map. His hands move. He is asking why Mary made this drawing today, and she, with patience born of 30 years of love, begins to tell the story. Gestures about stories Mary's grandmother used to tell, about how the people we love leave marks on our hearts that are more important than any sound. Leo smiles. That smile that only Mary can extract from that boy isolated in a mansion, surrounded by expensive tech and absent parents. In that moment, Edward is in the hallway, watching through the slightly open door. He sees that scene and understands nothing. He doesn't understand that language of silence. He doesn't understand why his son seems happier with a maid than with him. And because he doesn't understand, because he cannot control it, because he cannot improve it with money, he feels anger. A silent anger that will germinate, grow, and flower into a decision he had already made that morning. The conversation with Edward happens in that office, hours later, when Mary tries to show him the notebook. When she tries, for the first time in 30 years, to explicitly ask that they let her continue, that they understand there is a bond between her and Leo that cannot be broken by an employment contract. "I understand perfectly," Edward says, looking at the notebook as if it were trash. "But I need professionals, specialists." "But sir, Leo doesn't need specialists. He needs who? You?" Edward places the notebook on the desk. "Mary, you are an admirable woman, but you are no longer suitable. The house needs to evolve." And in that moment, Mary feels that amber glass bottle in her pocket, the home remedy she prepared for Leo's mother, the grandmother who never held her grandson because Edward considered her unsuitable to be in that mansion. Mary thinks of Leo seeing his father refuse that notebook, and she understands she cannot leave just yet, that this boy still needs her, that the truth that money doesn't cure isolation, that expensive implants don't teach a child to love themselves, this truth needs to be seen. It's sickening to see someone be discarded like this, isn't it? To see a child lose the only person who truly understands them. If you also think the injustice committed against Mary and Leo should be exposed, smash that like button now. Leave a comment telling me what you think about how Edward treated a woman who dedicated 30 years of her life to caring for his son. That night, while Edward sleeps in his master suite, that man who would never know his son cried silently under the covers, a tear rolling down his face because he had just understood, through a gesture of Mary's, that she was being taken away. Leo draws something new. He takes a pencil and draws with the concentration of an 8-year-old who has never heard a sound in his life. Mary's hand. Just the hand, holding his. Because for Leo, that hand is everything he knows of real love. And for Mary, that boy is the reason she is still there, fighting in silence, waiting for a chance to make a difference. 3 days passed. 3 days since Mary received the news. 3 days she spends pretending normality while dusting shelves and preparing meals no one eats together. Edward had given her 2 weeks' notice. 2 weeks to get her affairs in order and make room for the specialized team arriving the following Monday. But Mary isn't going to wait. She can't wait. On the morning of the 4th day, she puts on her uniform as always, sits in the small antechamber of Edward's office, and tries to schedule a meeting with his assistant. The woman, a certain Paula, wearing an expensive silk blouse and pink gel nails, doesn't even look up from her computer. "Paula, I just need 15 minutes with Mr. Edward. It's about Leo." "Mr. Edward doesn't have time for domestic matters," Paula replies, typing rapidly. "He has a board meeting in 20 minutes. But this is important. It's about the boy. Mary, are we good?" Paula's voice changes. It isn't cruelty. It's something worse. It is the tone used to speak to someone who doesn't belong in that place. Mr. Edward made it clear that issues related to the house and the child should be resolved with the house manager. You received the memo. Mary feels her face heat up. She places the worn notebook on the desk. That notebook she spent 30 years building. Page after page of gestures, of stories, of silent love. This notebook shows the progress Leo has made with me. If Mr. Edward could look at it for just a moment. Paula finally looks up. Her eyes go down to the notebook, then to Mary's face, and then back to the computer screen. The house manager will put that in the holding bin. Mary stands there holding that notebook, which is essentially her life, and realizes she is invisible, completely, totally invisible. She isn't a person asking for help. She is a cog that slipped out of place, a broken cog that needs to be replaced. She withdraws without saying a word. That afternoon, while Mary prepares lunch, Edward's wife, Mary Ann, comes down the stairs with a face Mary had never seen before. It isn't just disdain. It's something active. It's rage. "Mary, I need to talk to you." Mary places the knife on the cutting board. She already knows what's coming. She can feel it. "Last night, a watch disappeared from my nightstand. A Cartier. Expensive. Very expensive. I didn't... Let me finish." Mary Ann walks through the kitchen like a predator. "You spent 30 years here. 30 years earning an inadequate wage, sleeping in a windowless room, eating the leftovers of what you prepared. I understand you might feel resentful." "Not resentful, ma'am. I also observed, and other people observed too, your obsession with my son." Mary freezes. "Obsession?" The word comes out of Mary's throat like a whisper. "You touch him constantly. You whisper strange gestures to him. You isolate him from the therapists, the new professionals, the ones who cost more than you make in a year. Said your son had a harmful fixation, an emotional dependency that isn't healthy." Mary wants to speak, wants to say those therapists never sat next to Leo for 3 decades, that they don't know what real communication means, that Leo isn't dependent, he is loved, that the difference between love and fixation is intention, and Mary's intention was born of pure compassion. But Mary Ann isn't asking for arguments. Mary Ann is in a monologue she planned. "If you try to approach Leo again, if you insist on your inappropriate advances, I will call the police and report the disappearance of valuables. There are security cameras all over the house and you will be held responsible." "I didn't steal anything," says Mary, and her voice is so small it almost disappears. "Maybe not. Maybe just the door to your room wasn't locked. Maybe someone entered without you knowing." Mary Ann touches Mary's shoulder lightly, a gesture that should be conciliatory but lands like a blow. "Do you understand now? You are a threat to the balance of this house." And then she leaves, leaving Mary there, holding the knife, finally understanding that it isn't just the job she is losing. It is the right to exist in that place. That night, Mary sits in Leo's room with the notebook between her knees. The boy is lying down, and she sees the fear in his eyes. He knows. Somehow he knows something has changed, that the air is different, that the person who understands him is vanishing. Leo takes the notebook from her hands and opens to the last page. He points to the drawing, that gesture meaning, "You are special." And then his hands move, asking a silent question. Why did Mary draw this? And Mary, eyes full of tears she cannot contain, begins to sing to him. Not with her voice. She cannot use her voice here, not while the house watches her every move with suspicion. But with her hands. Her hands tell a story. Her hands dance in the air, describing a long path, describing a boy in a bubble, describing an old woman who learned over 3 decades that love doesn't always need sounds, that sometimes love is silence, it is presence, it is a hand that doesn't abandon you. Leo begins to cry. Silently, like everything in his life, tears stream down his face as he tries to understand that the hand that raised him, fed him, taught him true communication, is disappearing. Mary hugs him, and in that moment, in that cold room in a mansion of money, there are just 2 human beings loving each other in the purest way that exists. But that same night, while they embrace in the master bedroom upstairs, Marianne is on the phone with a private hospital. "Yes, I'm looking for therapists specialized in harmful attachment syndrome in deaf children. My son developed a fixation on an employee, and she is leaving. I think he will need medication while he adapts to the change." Her voice is professional. It is the voice of a concerned mother, but it is also the voice of someone who just turned love into a psychological disease. 2 days later, Mary watches Leo during breakfast. The boy doesn't touch his food. His eyes are fixed on a point far away, somewhere no one can reach. The new team of therapists arrives today. They brought new equipment, new methods, new hopes built on the destruction of an old, tired woman. The first therapist, a young, self-assured man with certifications from Europe, sits next to Leo during the session. He uses ASL signs, perfect, precise, professional. And Leo refuses. He shrinks away. He turns his face. That night, when Mary tucks the boy in, perhaps the last time she will do this, she sees he is gripping her uniform with small hands, trembling. And then, for no apparent reason, without logical motive, Leo begins to writhe. His entire body goes into panic. It is an anxiety attack, that thing doctors explain with PowerPoint charts. The therapists are called. They try their methods. They use their perfect signs. Nothing works. Leo is in a bubble of despair no one can pierce. Mary asks permission to try. The house manager hesitates. Marianne, watching from afar, nods approval. After all, if it works, she can say her therapists helped. If it doesn't work, she has a culprit. Mary sits next to Leo and starts doing what she has done for 30 years. Her hands move slowly, softly, weaving ancient stories. Stories the boy knows by heart. Stories about a boy who doesn't need to hear because he can feel. Stories about an old grandmother who loves him even having never hugged him. Stories about how things that seem to be ending never really end. They just change form. And Leo slowly comes back. His breathing slows. His body stops shaking. And when Mary finishes, when her hands finally rest, Leo is asleep with his head resting on her shoulder. That night, Mary takes her old cell phone, a phone that cost $50 and is practically an antique compared to the smartphones around her, and records a video. She records Leo in panic, his eyes full of terror. And then she records the transformation, records her hands telling the story, records Leo returning to calm, records the boy falling asleep, at peace on that shoulder holding him. It is a video of 4 minutes and 18 seconds. It is a video that proves unequivocally that there are more ways to heal than those listed in manuals. The next morning, Mary manages a moment with Edward. He is leaving for a business dinner, that kind of engagement that cannot be postponed, cannot be ignored, is infinitely more important than any domestic conversation. "Mr. Edward, just a moment. I recorded a video." He stops, turns to her. His eyes pass over Mary's face with the interest of someone observing an insect on a window pane. "Make it quick." Mary shows the video. 47 seconds of pure emotional impact. Edward watches. His face doesn't change. When it ends, he simply hands the phone back. "That is the therapist's job, Mary. They discovered a technique that works. Fulfill your duties until Thursday. Friday, you don't need to come in anymore." And he leaves. He gets into the luxury car with his perfect suit, leaving behind a woman holding an old phone with a video that should change everything, but changes nothing. It's revolting, isn't it? Seeing someone dedicate 30 years of their life, seeing that person be the only one to really know a child, and being discarded like used tissue paper. If you also think the injustice against Mary, against a woman who stole nothing, who only loved too much, should be brought to light, smash that like button now. Leave a comment telling me what you think about how Edward discarded the video that proved the truth. What would you do in Mary's place? The next morning, when Mary comes down the stairs, she sees a young woman wearing a uniform identical to hers. Bilingual, specialized, suitable. The house manager calls her to the office. Not Edward's office. The administrative office, that place where decisions about money are made. There is a letter on the desk, a termination letter for cause. The reason? Theft of a Cartier watch. Theft of personal valuables. The police were informed, says the house manager, reading a paper. But considering your age and years of service, Mrs. Marianne decided not to proceed with formal charges. You will receive 1 month of salary as severance. You need to be out of the house by tomorrow. Mary reads the letter 3 times, then reads it again. The words don't change. The meaning doesn't change. She is a criminal. She is the villain of this story. And the truth, that truth she tried to show through a 4-minute video, disappears under a narrative of theft and negligence. She tries to speak, tries to explain. But the house manager isn't interested in explanations. House managers are neutral. They are machines that execute orders. Mary goes to Leo's room. The boy is there, sitting on the bed using a new communication device. One that costs $7,000 and he doesn't know how to use because no one ever sat with him and said, with patience, that the point was simply to exist with the child, not correct him. He sees Mary, and he understands. In that face he sees goodbye. Mary cannot speak, cannot tell a story with her hands because her hands are shaking too much. She just hugs the boy, and he cries, silently, against her chest. That night, while packing in her windowless room, Mary puts the worn 30-year-old notebook inside the suitcase. She doesn't leave it. Maybe because she knows no one will understand it. Maybe because that notebook is the only proof she loved. The only evidence that her life inside that mansion meant something beyond dust and silence. The suitcase is small. Everything Mary built over 30 years fits in a worn rolling suitcase. There are clothes, a pair of flip-flops, the hardened photograph of a child, her nephew she barely knows because she never had money to pay for plane tickets. And there is the notebook that contains her life. She walks down the mansion stairs for the last time as a maid. The house manager walks her to the door. There are no hugs, no thank yous. There is just a woman handing over an envelope with the severance check and saying an Uber has been called. Leo is on the second-floor balcony. He doesn't know yet that this is the last time. But he knows something changed in the last few days. Mary raises her hand, not for a wave goodbye. She makes the ASL sign for love, the one she taught him 20 years ago, in story time, though he is 8 now. Fists crossed over the chest. Leo tries to come down, screams silently. That sound deaf children make when something hurts them deeply. A sound that isn't a voice, but is a scream nonetheless. The house manager holds him back. Mary gets into the Uber. The driver asks where to. She gives an address, a blue-collar neighborhood where her sister lives, the one who rarely visited her, the one who always looked at Mary's 30 years in that mansion with a mix of pity and envy. As the car pulls away, Mary opens the suitcase, takes out the notebook, leafs through the pages, seeing that whole life in gestures, in stories, in love drawn with a number 2 pencil. And then she takes that blank sheet she saved for this moment, draws, one last time, a heart, and next to it the hand making the sign for love. She places the drawing on the last page of the notebook, closes the suitcase with care, because she knows she is going to do something the house manager cannot know, something that is, in a way, her final goodbye. That night, while the house sleeps, while Edward is in his luxury suite, while Marianne reviews property documents, while the new employee sleeps in the room that was Mary's, an old woman walks up the mansion stairs one last time. She has a key. The house manager forgot to ask for it back, or maybe left it on purpose because even a human machine has compassion. Mary goes to Leo's room. The boy sleeps, but his sleep is restless. She places the notebook under the bed, in that secret space where children keep secrets. And next to it, she places the amber glass bottle, that remedy that cost everything, that love in the form of herbs and intention. She kisses the boy's forehead and leaves. The security camera at that angle captures everything, but no one is watching the cameras. No one is looking at the past in that moment. No one knows yet that the truth is being recorded. 3 days pass. Leo doesn't eat. It's not that he refuses food. It's that he can't. His body, that body that already suffered the injustice of being born deaf in a hearing world, now suffers the injustice of losing the only person who understood him. The therapists arrive with new equipment, tablets, specialized apps, methods approved by international boards. Leo ignores them. He sits on the bed and stares at the wall. Marianne calls the doctor. The doctor calls the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist prescribes medication, antidepressants for an 8-year-old child, because it is easier to medicate than to understand. On the 4th day, Leo does something no one expected. He takes off the cochlear implants, those that cost $40,000, those his father believed would save his life, takes them off and hides them under the pillow as if they were evidence of a crime. Edward doesn't feel sadness when he finds out. He feels anger. Anger that his investment was rejected. Anger that that child wouldn't cooperate with his own enhancement. Anger that money that solves everything, that buys everything, couldn't buy happiness. But on the night of the 5th day, when he sees Leo sitting on the bed with empty eyes, when he sees that boy who doesn't speak, who doesn't hear, who now doesn't feel anything either, something happens. Something stronger than anger. Something that is panic. Edward sits next to his son, tries to speak, tries to put his hands on the small shoulders. Leo doesn't react. He is present but absent. He is alive but dead. That night, Edward cannot sleep. He walks through the mansion like a ghost, looking for something he cannot name, looking for the person who knew what to do. The next day, on an impulse he himself doesn't understand, Edward goes to the security room. That place he rarely visits, where cameras monitor every inch of the mansion. He sits in front of the monitors and begins scrolling through the video history. Past weeks, past months. He looks for something, doesn't know what. And then he sees. He sees Mary, still young in his memory but exhausted in her body, sitting next to Leo. Her hands move. The boy responds. It isn't professional communication. It is living communication. It is communication existing in the space between two people who love each other. He sees Leo smile, that rare smile he had never seen before, and understands in that moment that his son was happy with that maid. His son had a life with that woman. Keeps scrolling, sees the moment he himself passes the door and observes that scene, sees the discomfort on his own face. That discomfort of not understanding, of not controlling, of not being able to improve something with money. Continues. Sees Mary showing him the notebook, sees his own gesture of rejection, sees that woman recoiling as if she had been physically struck. Continues. Sees Leo in panic, that video he himself witnessed. That moment Leo had an anxiety attack. Sees Mary arriving, sees her hands telling stories, sees Leo returning to calm, sees his son falling asleep, and then sees the moment Mary came back at night, sees her hiding the notebook under Leo's bed, sees her placing the amber glass bottle, sees her kissing the boy's forehead. Edward pauses the video at that moment. On that tranquil face of a woman who dedicated 30 years of her life to loving someone who wasn't her son, but who was everything to her. Behind him, on the laptop he left open, his stock quote plummets. A drop of 7%, a loss of millions. His two fortunes, the money and the son, are crumbling simultaneously. But Edward isn't looking at the laptop. He is looking at Mary's face on that security screen, and finally understands what he did. It wasn't theft. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't inadequacy. It was love. And he killed love with money, and now the money is disappearing too. Edward leaves the security room like a man who just saw his own face for the first time and hates what he sees. Walks up the stairs. Enters Leo's room. The boy is there, holding the cochlear implants in his hand like they were burnt bones. Leo. He says his son's name, and then understands, to his own horror, that he said the name out loud, in sounds, in a language his son cannot hear. He tries to speak with his hands, but his hands don't know how. His hands were created to sign contracts, to shake hands in business meetings, to point toward objectives to be achieved. His hands don't know how to tell stories. Leo watches him without expression. Edward sits on the bed, that bed where Mary sat, and cries silently, like someone crying in a language no one speaks. Because now he understands there is a silence that is love, and there is a silence that is death, and he chose to kill. That same night, in a blue-collar neighborhood of the city, Mary receives a phone call. "Yes, did you work at Dr. Edwards' house for 30 years? "Yes, I worked. We would like to speak with you about a security matter, about a theft we don't believe was a theft." Mary feels her heart race, not from fear, from hope. Mary and Leo's story made the news. The papers called it "The Invisible Maid Who Saved the Invisible Child." Social media caught fire, before and after videos of that panicked boy being calmed by the hands that raised him. Photos of the notebook with 30 years of gestures, stories, love. The police investigated. The cochlear implants weren't stolen. The Cartier watch was never found, because it never disappeared. Marianne had sold it 3 months earlier to pay gambling debts no one knew she had. Edward apologized publicly, offered money, offered a mansion. But Mary didn't accept anything except one thing that cost more than any mansion. She accepted being rehired, not as a maid, as Leo's certified therapist. And so, she returned, not in a worn white uniform, but with a contract recognizing her, recognizing those 30 years, recognizing that there are forms of healing you cannot buy in expensive pharmacies. Leo hugged her at the door, and didn't even need hands to tell that story. Because the hug said everything. This story taught us something profound. It showed us that true love doesn't need money, technology, specialization. That sometimes, the most important person in our lives is the one no one sees. The one working behind the scenes. The one who loves without asking for recognition. And that justice, true justice, is recognizing those who were invisible. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that make us remember we are human before being anything else, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like. Comment. Tell me, what was the moment you felt the injustice against Mary the most? Be part of our family of stories that transform hearts. Edward doesn't sleep. He spends the entire night with Mary's address in his hand, an address he obtained through his contacts, through that exercise of power he always used to get what he wanted. But this time he doesn't want money. He wants redemption. He wants the possibility of not being the villain of that story. The next morning, he drives to the outskirts. The GPS takes him to a street where the houses are small, where the streets don't have pretty names like those in his neighborhood, where people don't have garages, but cars parked on the street as if they were treasures. He finds the house. It is small. The walls need painting. There's a window with security bars. But there are also flowers in a broken ceramic pot, replanted carefully as if someone believed that even broken things could be a beginning. He knocks on the door. A woman opens. It isn't Mary. It is an older woman, even more worn than Mary, but with that same expression of infinite patience. Her eyes move to Edward as if asking who was that well-dressed man standing at her door. "Is Mary here?" asks Edward. "Depends," replies the woman. Her voice is slow, careful. "Are you police?" "No, I am." He pauses. "I am Leo's father." The woman makes no expression, just steps out of the way and points inside the house. The living room is small. The walls are covered with papers, not art prints, but sheets and sheets of paper taped up, each filled with drawings of signs. They are decades of visual communication stuck to the walls like a cathedral of gestures. There are bookshelves, old books, clinical audiology, sign linguistics, language development in deaf children. Some have notes in the margins, pencil underlines, histories of study built during nights of insomnia. And there, sitting in a wheelchair, is another woman. Her eyes move to Edward, but there is no sound. There is nothing but silence and that look that seems to contain questions that will never be asked out loud. Mary enters the room. She is different, not in a white uniform anymore. She wears simple clothes and her hair is tied back practically. She sees Edward and her expression doesn't change. It is as if she already knew he would come. Mr. Edward. Mary, I found out. From the cameras. I found out you didn't steal? Mary sits next to the woman in the wheelchair, places her hand on her shoulder, a gesture that is comfort and communication simultaneously. You already knew that. But why didn't you defend yourself? Why didn't you tell the truth? Mary observes him, and there is a wisdom in that look Edward had never noticed before. It is as if for 30 years he had looked at Mary without really seeing her. Which truth, Mr. Edward? The truth that I have a degree? The truth that I lost my license? The truth that I spent years working as a maid because I didn't have the courage to say the truth? Edward feels the floor disappear beneath his feet. You were a speech-language pathologist? Mary stands and walks to that wall covered in papers, points to an old yellowed sheet, dated 27 years ago. I worked at a private clinic, that clinic you know, the one in the rich neighborhood. Had a patient, a 5-year-old child, deaf. His parents wanted implants, expensive implants. Implants the clinic received a commission for prescribing. Mary takes the sheet off the wall. Her hands tremble slightly. I tried to show an alternative method. Tried to show that child would respond better to a multisensory approach before any surgery. But the parents wanted the implant. The head doctor, you know him of course because you recommend him for Leo, refused my opinion. She pauses. The child died 6 months later. It wasn't the implant's fault. It was a post-surgical infection. But it was my fault according to the investigation. My fault for having questioned the recommended method. My fault for offering a perspective that didn't profit the clinic. Edward feels the words like punches. They revoked my license. Said I was irresponsible, that I was endangering children. No one believed me. All those people you associate with, those doctors, those well-placed in society, they simply accepted the narrative. A woman with different ideas, a woman questioning profit. It was easier to destroy. Mary walks to the woman in the wheelchair and places a hand on her face with infinite tenderness. This is my sister, Lucy. She is deaf and mute since birth. When I lost my license, she came to live with me. No one else needed a speech therapist, but Lucy needed a sister. So I spent 25 years developing a method for her. A method that mixed signs with tactile stimuli, with visual rhythm, with the way she could understand the world. Mary takes the amber glass bottle from a shelf. That same bottle Edward had seen in Mary's hands in that first scene. You see this? It is just a mixture of calming herbs. Chamomile, ginger, honey. Nothing special. Nothing that cures deafness. But Lucy takes it every night, and her body recognizes it is time to rest. Her body recognizes a ritual of care. She puts the bottle back. When you hired the bilingual team for Leo, I understood. I understood you didn't understand me. But Leo understood me. And I had spent 25 years understanding a deaf child. Understanding not just how to communicate, but how to make that child know he was loved. Edward feels tears burning his eyes. Why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't you defend yourself? Because, Mary sits again, if I said I was degreed, you would think you had a right to me, that you could buy me, that you could use me as a specialized instrument. What you really needed wasn't a speech therapist. It was someone who loved your son despite you not knowing how. Edward wants to speak, but can't. The words die in his throat. That morning, While Edward was at Mary's house, Marianne received a call from a friend. The friend had searched Mary on social media, had discovered old posts from clinic colleagues, old articles about the case that destroyed the speech therapist's career. When Edward returns home, Marianne is in the living room with her laptop. Her face is a mixture of anger and contempt. "You brought her into the house," she says, not as a question but as an accusation. "Marianne, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. A failed therapist, a woman destroyed professionally. You brought a degreed beggar into our house to care for our son." The word beggar hangs in the air. Edward sees in that moment how his wife's contempt isn't just for Mary. It is for anyone not living up to her expectations. It is a fundamental contempt for the humanity of those who don't have enough money. "She isn't a beggar," says Edward, and his voice is different now, stronger. "She is a woman who lost everything because she refused to profit from a child's pain. She is a woman who spent 25 years developing a method for her own sister. She is the only person in this house who actually loved our son." That is ridiculous. Leo had therapists. Leo had professionals who treated him like a project. Mary treated him like a human being. Marianne stands up. Her face is red. "Are you going to bring her back? Are you going to humiliate this family, bringing a woman who was destroyed professionally to work here?" "No," says Edward. "We have destroyed enough already." That afternoon, Edward returns to Mary's house. He knocks on the door with an urgency he didn't have before. Mary opens. Her eyes already know. "I want you to come back," says Edward, "as a therapist, with a professional contract, with recognition." Mary observes him for a long time. "No," she says finally. The word is simple, but holds the weight of a sentence. "Mary, please. You don't understand yet." She walks to the shelf and pulls out an envelope. It is yellowed, sealed with Mary's handwriting on the front. It has a date from weeks ago. "I already knew I would be kicked out. I knew there was no way to stay. So I prepared this for Leo." She hands the envelope to Edward. "What is this?" "It is what Leo needs to know. It is a letter, not in words, in drawings, in gestures. Everything I learned over 30 years, like a visual dictionary. Like a manual on how to be loved by someone who cannot hear, but can feel." Edward holds the envelope as if it were made of glass. "You don't understand," says Mary, her voice firm now, decided. "I didn't come back for you. I don't come back because you offer a contract or money. I already healed what I could there. Leo learned he is loved. He learned it is worth communicating. He learned there is a language just for him and me." She opens the door a little wider. "The rest," she continues, "is his father's responsibility. It is your responsibility to learn to speak the language of silence. It is your responsibility to become what Leo needed you to be. And if I can't, then," Mary places her hand over her heart, "he will have this envelope, and he will know a person dedicated 30 years to teaching him that love exists, that someone believed he deserved to be understood." Edward feels the weight of that truth. "Mary, I am sorry. Sorry for what we did. Apologies don't heal wounds, Mr. Edward. Actions heal. You need to go home and learn your son's language. You need to discover there are forms of communication that don't involve money. You need to understand there are people who love without asking for recognition, and you destroyed them for not comprehending the value of that love." Mary closes the door, not with anger, with firmness. Edward stands there, holding the envelope, finally understanding that the true cure isn't for Leo. It is for him. It is learning to see what was invisible for 30 years. It is learning that not everything broken needs to be fixed with money. Sometimes broken things just need to be understood. And as he holds that envelope, he imagines Leo waiting for him at home, imagines his son looking out the window, waiting for the person who could learn to love him in the language he knows. The language of silence, which is, in truth, the most eloquent language that exists. The papers call it the fall of the humanitarian millionaire. But Edward knows it isn't a fall. It is destruction. And destruction is exactly what he deserved. Marianne abandons him 3 months after the truth comes out. She takes legal consultants, takes half the fortune, takes the prestige of a name she never really wanted. She disappears to Miami with a new man, someone even richer, even emptier. She leaves no note. She doesn't need to. Her departure is a sentence. Edward's company suffers. His competitors, those just waiting for an opportunity, attack. His partners, those who called him friend at fine dinners, abandon him at conferences. One of them offers a deal. A clean, professional deal, just a little unethical. It would save the company. It would save his fortune. Edward refuses. Why? Asks his financial consultant, genuinely confused. You have the opportunity to recover completely. Because, says Edward, and his face is the face of a man who finally understands the price of things, I have destroyed enough. I will not profit from one more destruction. The company falls, not fast, slowly, like someone giving up on living. Edward sells his assets, sells the mansion, sells the car that cost more than the house where Mary lives, sells every symbol of his previous life. But he doesn't become a beggar. He becomes a teacher. 6 months after Mary's expulsion, there is a small institute in a blue-collar neighborhood, the Silent Communication Institute. A simple sign, discreet, without names of big donors, because the donor asked for anonymity. But everyone knows. Everyone whispers it is the millionaire who lost everything. Mary is the technical director. For the first time in 27 years, she has an official title, an office with her name on the door. Children arriving with desperate parents believing deafness is death. And Mary shows them, through the method she developed over decades, that deafness is just a different language. The institute has 8 children in the first month, 30 in the second, 60 in the third. The mothers arrive with eyes red from crying, not from pain, but from hope. One mother in particular brings her son and asks, "Will he hear?" "No," says Mary, and her voice is calm. "But he will understand he is loved." And that is more important than any sound. The woman cries, but this time it is relief. Edward takes a course in ASL, not professional ASL, that perfect language specialized therapists teach. He takes classes with an old teacher who is deaf since birth, a woman who tolerates no arrogance, accepts no excuses, who only expects him to listen, that he really listens. The first weeks are pure humiliation. His fingers don't know how to curl. His movements are rigid, mechanical, void of meaning. The teacher corrects him relentlessly. "You are making the gesture," she says through an interpreter, "but you aren't saying anything. There is a void between your fingers. Fill it with intention." Months pass. Edward eats, sleeps, dreams in ASL. His fingers start to find rhythm. His arms learn to move as if they were breath. It isn't perfect, but it is genuine. One day, when he feels he can finally try something, he goes back home. Back to that house he bought with the fortune he sold now. A simple house, appropriate for a man who finally learned the difference between appropriate and excessive. Leo is in his room. He doesn't turn when Edward enters. Continued not turning for 6 months. Continued closed inside himself, listening to a silence that was death. Edward sits next to his son. His hands tremble. He thinks of the notebook. He takes the worn notebook from his pocket, the one Mary instructed him to take home, the one containing 30 years of love in the form of gestures. He opens to the first page and tries. His fingers move. The gesture means, "Good morning." It is imperfect, awkward, almost ridiculous. Leo doesn't react. Edward turns another page. This gesture means, "You are smart." His fingers contort, trying to reproduce the drawing. It is like trying to write with the wrong hand. It is like trying to breathe in a language that isn't yours. Leo remains impassive, page after page, gesture after gesture. Edward fails repeatedly. Every failure is a small death. Every failure is a memory of everything he destroyed, of everything he lost. His hands sweat. His eyes burn. He wants to give up. wants to leave that notebook on the floor and leave that room and go back to his new simple and forgotten life. But then he turns the page. It is the last page, the one Mary drew. A heart, and next to it, the hand making the sign for love in ASL. Edward looks at that drawing and understands that is it. It is everything he needs to say. He raises his hand. His fingers curl awkwardly, locked, full of hesitation. He tries to reproduce the gesture. It is imperfect. It is pathetic compared to Mary's fluid gestures. It is the exact representation of a man trying to learn a language never created for his mouth, or rather, for his hands. The gesture comes out. It is almost comical in its awkwardness. But it is genuine. It is real. It is a father trying to tell his son he loves him. Leo slowly turns his head. His eyes meet Edward's eyes. There is no expression. There is only observation. There is only a boy studying the face of the man who destroyed him and is now trying to rebuild. Edward keeps his hand in the air, trembling. The hand of a man who lost everything trying to make a gesture of love in a language he barely understands. And then slowly Leo raises his hand. His fingers curl. His movements are fluid, perfect, the result of 30 years of silent communication with Mary. He reproduces the gesture, but not his father's imperfect gesture. He reproduces the perfect gesture. The gesture meaning love. The gesture Mary taught him. And when he does, when Leo completely raises his hand and reproduces that sign perfectly, he looks into his father's eyes. And there is something in that look no one expected to find. There is recognition. It isn't forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness is a luxury. Forgiveness takes time. Forgiveness takes more than one imperfect gesture. But there is recognition. There is the understanding that that man entered a world not his own, learned a language not made for his mouth and tried, even if clumsily, to tell his son he loves him. Edward feels the tears fall. And Leo, watching those tears roll down his father's face, does something he hasn't done in 6 months. He smiles. It isn't a big smile. It isn't a magic healing smile. It is a small movement of the corners of the mouth, meaning there is, in that silence, the possibility of reconstruction. Edward places Mary's notebook between them, and father and son, one speaking the language of money that destroyed, the other speaking the language of silence that heals, begin to learn. 2 years later, Mary, Leo, and Edward's story became a documentary, won international awards. Millions watched and understood, perhaps for the first time, that there are more languages in the world than just those we can hear. Mary, now recognized professionally, her name cleared, her certifications restored, her old colleagues from the clinic who destroyed her exposed, doesn't celebrate notoriety. She keeps teaching, keeps developing the method, keeps helping deaf children understand they are loved. Lucy, her sister, greets visitors to the Institute with gestures that took decades to develop. She still doesn't hear. But now, dozens of other children understand the silence she lived in is a safe place. It is a place where there is communication. It is a place where there is love. Edward sold what remained of his fortune. Not everything. He still needs to live, but enough to fund the Institute for a decade. He now works as a consultant for companies wanting to understand corporate communication with real inclusion. He earns less than he earned when he was a millionaire, but he earns enough to sleep. Leo, now 10, is still deaf, will still be deaf for the rest of his life. But he is no longer a lonely child in a mansion of expensive tech. He is a child who knows there is a person, his father, who learned painfully to speak the language he speaks. The relationship between Edward and Leo isn't perfect. There are days Edward fails the gestures and Leo shuts down. There are days the silence between them is death again. But there are also days father and son talk about clouds, about animals, about how life feels when you can't hear but can feel. And that is the real cure. It isn't a miracle. It isn't a magic implant making the boy hear sounds. It isn't expensive technology buying happiness. It is a man who lost everything because he finally understood the value of everything. It is a man who learned there are languages not listed in manuals, that there are children who need fathers who listen, not with ears, but with the heart. At the graduation of the first group of children from the Silent Communication Institute, Mary, Lucy, Edward, Leo, and the old deaf ASL teacher are all sitting together. The children, as a group, do a presentation. They tell a story with their hands. It is Mary and Leo's story. It is the story of how an invisible woman saved an invisible child. It is the story of how a man lost everything to finally understand there are things you cannot buy. When they finish, the entire audience stands up. There is no sound. There is no traditional clapping. There is a silence that is respect. There are people waving their hands in the air, that gesture that in that space means applause. Edward and Leo look at each other, and father and son make together the heart-love gesture Mary drew. Simple, imperfect in some cases, perfect in others, but absolutely true. This is the lesson this story leaves us. True healing isn't eliminating what makes us different. It is recognizing there are languages in every person we love, languages that can only be understood if we refuse to hear with contempt and learn to listen with compassion. If this story touched you, if you understood there are invisible people around you, people who love without asking for recognition, then subscribe to the channel, smash that like button, comment what was the most important lesson you took from this story. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they are reminders that there is still time to learn to listen, still time to learn the language of silence, still time to be better. Be part of our community of stories that transform hearts.